Episode 1, The Whisper in the Box. They say the confessional is a place for redemption. That night, it became a portal. Father Ellen had heard thousands of sins. Adulterers, thieves, men who wept over what their fists had done, but never had someone confess something so wordless. The boy didn't get a name. He couldn't. There were no words for what he had done. Only trembling. Only silence. And then, the scream. It began with the candle. The chapel was old, one of those stone-hewn cathedrals, where silence clings to the walls like moss. The night was cold. Outside, the wind moved like something hunting. Inside, Father Ellen waited in the wooden confessional, eyes closed, hands clasped. It was 2:33 a.m. No one should have been there. And yet, footsteps. A boy, no older than 12, barefoot, face pale as bone, entered the booth on Saturday. His breathing was sharp, panicked, but he said nothing for a full 5 minutes. Then, he whispered, "I saw him, not in heaven, in the cellar." Father Ellen leaned forward. Saw who? Child, the one who wrote the Bible, before God found it. The priest frowned. The air turned heavy, like the stone was listening. "What do you mean?" "I stole something from a dream, and it followed me here." Before Ellen could respond, the candle outside the confessional cracked. Its flame didn't die, it turned black. Not smoke, fire, but darker than night. And the scream came, not from the child, from above. The sound ripped through the chapel roof, a shriek of celestial agony. Every statue cracked, every crucifix bled. The pews groaned like they were being crushed by something unseen. And the boy, gone, all that remained was the echo of his last words. He said, "There is no forgiveness for what I've done," because the sin had no name. Father Ellen stumbled out. His ears bled, but he heard something deep inside the confessional wall, scratching, etching, as if something ancient had begun writing. That night, he locked the chapel and buried the keys. But by morning, 3 more boys were waiting, barefoot, silent, and each held a page, torn from a book that wasn't supposed to exist. Episode 2, The Page That Burned Without Fire. The first page read, Genesis. Before light, Father Ellen didn't want to look, but one of the boys placed the parchment on the altar, and it trembled as though the paper itself feared what it carried. There were no letters, only symbols carved into the fibers, not inked, as if the message had been scratched from the inside of the paper. Ellen tried to pray, "Our Father, who art," and the page screamed, not aloud, not in sound, but inside his skull, like a cry that echoed from the marrow of something sacred and dying. He collapsed. Blood ran from his nose. His vision blurred. One of the boys stepped forward, his voice calm, unnatural. He said, "You're the only one who can translate it." "Oh," Ellen croaked. The other who was erased. Ellen stared at the boy. He had no shadow, and neither did the others. That night, Father Ellen dreamt. He stood beneath the chapel, but the chapel had no foundation. It floated above a pit of pages, millions of them writhing like worms. They whispered in unison, "Give it a name, and it will live again." When he woke, the boys were gone, but that page remained, still on the altar, still whispering. And now, it had begun to bleed. In the margins, new words appeared. "You opened the door with a sin no one could name. Now name it, or heaven won't be the only one screaming." Episode 3, The Blood on God's Signature. The stain on the altar would not dry. Father Ellen had cleaned it 3 times. Salt, vinegar, even holy water, but the dark red smear only whitened, as if the page bled into the stone itself. Worse, the whispering didn't stop. It had grown rhythmic, a low chant, pulsing with every tick of the chapel's ancient clock. He covered the altar with a cloth. That's when he saw it, a 4th page. He hadn't seen it arrive. It hadn't been delivered by the boys. It was simply there, lying neatly over the cloth like a forgotten relic. And on it, one sentence etched in what looked like dry marrow. God signed his name in blood, but not his own. Ellen trembled. He remembered an apocryphal text he once studied in seminary, a bent scroll, supposedly found beneath the ruins of an old monastery in Syria, one that spoke of an agreement written before the creation of light, an agreement that required sacrifice from both sides. But only one bled, and now it seemed that covenant had returned. The chapel door slammed shut behind him. He turned. A man was there, or what were a man's skin, tall, featureless. Its eyes were pits, but something inside them moved, like hands clawing at glass. It didn't speak. It only raised his finger and pointed to the confessional. The same booth, the same dark corner where it all began. Father Ellen, against his will, walked toward it. When he entered, it wasn't wood that surrounded him anymore. It was bone. The walls pulsed like flesh. The air was warm, wet, breathing. A voice echoed, "Give the sin a name." But he couldn't, because what the boy had done was not done by the boy alone. It had been shared. And now, it was Father Ellen's turn to remember. Episode 4, The Saint Who Screamed First. Father Ellen couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same vision. An infant in a baptismal font filled not with water but ash. And above it, an angel with no face, whispering into the child's ear with a mouth sewn shut. He jolted awake in his rectory, gasping for air. It was 3:03 a.m., a knock at the chapel door. No one should have been outside. And yet, he felt the presence, even before opening it. She stood there, not a child this time. A woman, middle-aged, skin like porcelain, robes like a nun's but with no emblem, no order. Her eyes were cloudy, almost white, but she moved with certainty. She held nothing in her hands, but when she stepped past him into the chapel, blood appeared at her feet. With every step, the tiles hissed. "You were the first," she said. Father Ellen frowned. "The first what?" "The first to scream. Long ago, before even the boys returned to remember." "You forgot." "Because it was mercy to forget." She walked to the altar and Saturday beside the page. The bleeding had stopped. She touched it with her finger. The whispering returned, louder now, urgent. "You confessed it once," she said, "in another life, before the name was buried." But heaven couldn't bear to hold it. He knelt before her, something ancient breaking in his chest. "Who are you?" "I was the saint they burned to silence, the first to name the sin, the one that made the angels turn their faces away. I remember, because I was never allowed to die." Father Ellen could feel his heart slowing, his breath thinned. She placed her hand on his forehead, and then he remembered it all. The dream before birth, the original prayer that cursed the sky, the scream that cracked the first heaven, and his own voice chanting it. When he opened his eyes, the woman was gone, but on the 4th page, the blood had formed a name, and it was his. Episode 5, where the choir refused to sing. The next morning, the bells rang by themselves. Not just once, 13 times. The sound echoed through the town, waking the faithful and the damned alike. But no one dared step foot inside the chapel. Word had spread of the bleeding altar, of the children with no shadows, of the scream that had no mouth, but left cracks in stained glass. Father Ellen stood at the doorway. He hadn't slept, couldn't, not after his name bled from a page written by something older than scripture. A letter had appeared under the door, yellowed, folded once. Inside, a drawing, a choir, all with stitched lips. He knew what it meant. He had to open the choir pit, the sunken chamber beneath the chapel, where no voice had echoed in over 50 years, where the singers once practiced before the fire, before the silence. The pit was locked behind iron gates. As he turned the key, he felt his breath shorten. The air beneath the chapel was colder, but not dead. It vibrated, like music that had forgotten its notes. There were no pews down there, only chairs in a circle, and in the center, a 5th page. This one didn't bleed. It hummed, soft, beautiful, sinister. He picked it up. A line appeared across the parchment, forming as if someone were writing from inside the paper. Praise without truth is blasphemy, and that is how heaven was first wounded. He felt it then. The weight of every song sung with a lie on the tongue. Every choir that praised without knowing what they praised. Every sermon that danced around the silence. That pit pulsed. He looked up. The ceiling above him, the chapel floor, was translucent now. People had begun gathering above. They were kneeling, not praying, listening. The page in his hand rose from his palms on its own. The humming grew louder. The walls began to sweat. And then from somewhere deep below, even the choir pit, a single note. A voice not of man, not of angel. A voice that had been silent since the first choir was erased. It sang one word, return. And Father Ellen wept, not from fear, but from the memory of who he had once led and what they sang into being. Episode 6, The Sound That Was Never Forgiven. The voice that said, "Return," did not end with silence. It left an imprint in the walls, on the people kneeling above, and deepest of all, inside Father Allen's chest, a vibration that no ear could catch but every bone remembered. He walked out of the pit, the 5th page still hovering behind him like a reluctant angel. The townspeople didn't speak. Their faces were pale, tear-streaked, as if they had all remembered something too sacred to curse to name. Ellen stepped outside. The sky had changed, cloudless, crimson, and something circled above the chapel's spire. A figure cloaked in gold, wings neither feathered nor fire but torn parchment flapping in wind that didn't blow. It watched him, and then it sang, but no sound came out. And yet he heard it. "Do you remember the sound they punished me for?" He fell to his knees. This was no angel. This was the composer, not of heaven, but of the note that ruptured it long ago, before Eden, before light. There was a melody sung by a being who believed truth could be louder than obedience. That sound had been sealed, exiled, and now it wanted to be sung again. Father Allen heard the 6th page fall from the sky. It didn't land. It entered him. He screamed it in pain, but in harmony, and for a moment, the air itself vibrated with memory. The way creation almost was, a version of Genesis that began not with words, but with a song too perfect to survive unpunished. And then he collapsed. When he opened his eyes, the sky was empty, the people were gone, but the walls of the chapel were inscribed, lines of musical notation written in bleeding staves across every stone. And in the confessional, the candle had returned, but this time, the flame was singing. Episode 7, The Gospel That Tried to Unwrite Itself. The musical notations bled through the stone-like veins beneath skin. Father Allen Saturday in the middle of the chapel floor, no longer praying, no longer weeping, dumbly listening. The singing candle hummed a note that shifted with his breath. The walls echoed with a score no hand had written. He wasn't alone. The pews had filled silently with strangers. None of them blinked. None of them moved. They held their hands clasped, but backward, thumbs facing the floor, palms tight as if grasping something that couldn't be seen. He knew their posture. They were readers. He had once read something like them, a passage from a banned scripture in a monastery that no longer stood, a text older than forgiveness. And now, they were here. A 7th page floated down. It landed before the altar, curling like it resisted being touched. On its surface, not text, not symbols but erasures, black smudges, clawed lines, empty spaces, as if the paper had once held a gospel too terrible to remain. It was trying to forget itself, but something still whispered beneath the void. Father Allen crawled to it. His fingers trembled as it touched the corner. Immediately, a voice split through his skull. "Unwrite the lie, and you wake what sleeps beneath Eden." He staggered back. From the walls, the musical notes detached. They floated, and then rearranged. A new melody formed in the air, low, discordant, and unnatural. The notes shaped themselves into words. "I was never crucified. I was buried awake." Father Allen screamed, but no sound came. One of the strangers stood. Her face was stitched where the mouth should be. She walked to him, lifted a mirror from beneath her robe, and held it before his eyes. His reflection smiled, but it wasn't smiling. In the mirror, he wore robes made of ink. His skin glowed like parchment, and written across his chest, Chapter 8, The Gospel According to Ellen. The page behind him caught fire without flame, without smoke, just burning, and still trying to erase itself. Episode 8, The Confessional That Remembered Too Much. The mirror shattered, not from his hand, from the reflection. As Father Allen stumbled backward, shards of glass floated mid-air, suspended like frowning drops of time. Each shard reflected something different, not himself, but faces, down scenes, hundreds, all versions of him in different robes, centuries apart, screaming without sound. The woman who held the mirror was gone, but a new figure Saturday in the confessional booth, veiled, cloaked in black. Its presence was neither cold nor warm, but hollow like an empty tomb. He approached. "Speak," Ellen whispered. The figure did not. Instead, it placed a hand through the veil. In its palm, an 8th page, but this one was bound in flesh. He did not want to touch it, but the candle began to sing again, this time a lullaby. A lullaby he remembered. His mother used to hum it as if fell asleep beneath the wooden cross in her bedroom. A tune only they knew, a song that had never been written. He touched the page, and the chapel changed. Suddenly, he was back in the confessional booth, but it was younger. No cracks, no candle, a memory, but it wasn't alone. A child Saturday behind the screen. I heard him, the child said. "Oh," Ellen asked. "The one who waits in the gospel without a spine." The child lifted his hand. Blood poured from his palm, thick, black, ancient, and on the wood between them, a word carved itself. Behold, the walls of the confessional split open. The flesh-bound page unfolded, revealing not words but rows of teeth. Cages do not bite unless they were written with hunger. The voice returned. Every sin becomes scripture when no one dares name it. You are the writer now. What you choose not to say will be some for you. Ellen fell forward. The confessional was empty again, but beneath his robes, the flesh page had grafted itself to his chest, and it was breathing. Episode 9. The saint inside the walls. The walls pulsed, not metaphorically they breathed, like lungs tool to carry grace, exhaling dust and memory. The chapel had become a body, and Father Ellen was now inside it. The flesh page on his chest throbbed in sync with the floor beneath him. And then, a knock from inside the stone. 3 soft raps, like knuckles tapping wood, except this was granite, centuries old. Ellen turned toward the sound. One of the wall panels, one beside the statue of Saint Jenner, began to crack. Blood leaked from the seams. The stone split open, and behind it, a woman. Her body was sealed in the wall like a relic, alive, eyes open, breathing, mouth stitched. She was covered in scripture, carved into her skin. Every word writhed. Ellen collapsed to his knees. He knew her face, not from memory, from liturgy. She was Saint Gunara, patron of silence, martyred for refusing to repeat the lie heaven demanded. Her eyes moved. She was trying to speak. He leaned in. A word burned itself into the stone beneath her feet. UMBIND. He reached for the stitches across her mouth. The moment he touched them, the candle blew out, not from wind, from judgment. The chapel darkened, but in the silence, her voice roared from her mouth, but from every crack in the stone. You wrote the sin by forgetting it. Now remember the scream that created you. The flesh page on his chest curled open like a flower. Inside it, a final line of scripture not yet written. The ink waited, and in his bones, he heard the scream not of pain, not of punishment, but of birth. Episode 10. The ink that would not dry. The chapel did not return to silence. After Gunara's voice roared from the walls, everything changed. The floor beneath Father Ellen's knees shifted, stone cracking not with weight, but with memory. The ink inside the flesh page on his chest pulsed like a second heart. And still, it did not write, because it was not ready. Not until he remembered it all. The pews were gone. In their place stood down scenes of cloaked figures. Each carried a book that bled at the seams, bound with veils instead of leather. None had faces, but each turned a page at the same time, in perfect rhythm, as if following a script they hated but could not disobey. Ellen rose to his feet. I don't know what to write, he said aloud. A voice answered in it, divine, not demonic. Just hold, then bleed instead. His fingers curled, blood dripped from his cuticles. The floor below him drank it, and in that crimson trail, symbols began to etch themselves ancient. Looping, alive, a shadow emerged from the apse. It looked like Ellen, but younger, hungrier. It smiled. Do you know what the first scream said? It asked. Ellen shook his head. The shadow leaned close. It said, I refuse. The books the hooded figures held burst open, pages flying, spiraling upward, forming a black halo over the altar. And there, descending like a final punctuation, the 9th page. It didn't land. It hovered before Ellen's chest, trembling. The ink from within him rose to meet it, writing itself upon the page without his hand. One line appeared. The sin that has no name is the name we bury to protect ourselves from knowing we once committed it together. The ink pulsed. That chapel moaned. Saint Gunara's body cracked from the wall and fell into the light, alive and smiling. Episode 11. The sermon that was never preached. Saint Gunara did not speak with her lips. She simply pointed to the pulpit. The altar, once the center of prayer, now recoiled as if ashamed of the truth resting on its surface. The 9th page trembled mid-air, ink still wet, bleeding from words never meant to be spoken. Father Ellen understood. It was time to speak the unspeakable. He stepped into the pulpit. The choir pit behind him hummed low like the breath of something waiting to rise. The hooded congregation turned toward him, their blank faces now dripping ink, as if truth was melting through the masks they'd worn since time began. "I am not your priest," Ellen said. "I am your echo." He unbuttoned the front of his cassock, revealing the flash page stitched to his chest. It moved twitching like an unborn thing beneath skin. Gunara ascended the steps beside him, barefoot, each step echoing with invisible screams. "You bury the sin," she said. "Now speak its name. Let it live." Ellen closed his eyes. The air thickened. Every window in the chapel went dark, not shattered, sealed. He opened his mouth, and the voice that came out was not his. It was the first, the scream that tore the veil, the cry that birthed disobedience. It wasn't rage, it was recognition. "I remember," the voice thundered, "when obedience Washington, as a light dressed in light." The 9th page ignited. The congregation burned but made no sound. They bowed as flames consumed them. And behind Ellen, the choir pit opened, not downward, upward, into something blinding. He turned to Gunara. Her eyes shimmered, filled with a sadness deeper than damnation. This was the sermon heaven never wanted heard. She whispered, "And now it has been spoken." The chapel began to rise in space, but in time, and something was waiting at the summit. Episode 12, The Throne Without a God. The chapel did not fly, it ascended through something older than space. Time peeled away, stone turned to breath, breath turned to memory, and memory, at last, turned to light, but not divine light, not the warm mercy preached by priests or sung in psalms. This light was sharp, unforgiving, truth in its most unmasked form. Father Ellen stood at the summit of the chapel's impossible climb. There was no sky, only the throne, and it was empty, gold twisted like vines around it. But they were wilted. The seat bore the imprint of something once vast but now absent. Above it, the symbol once known as God's eye had been torn in half. It wept ink. Saint Gunara fell to her knees. "This is where heaven stopped speaking," she whispered. Ellen stepped forward. The flash page on his chest had stilled. Its ink was dry, its words complete. He knew what he had to do. Speak not to God, but for God. He stood before the throne. The 9th page hovered beside him, still smoldering, edges curling like judgment's breath. "I name it now," Ellen said. "The sin that has no name." The chapel trembled. The sin of silence, of worship without questioning, of faith without remembering. The throne cracked. A single beam of light descended from above. But within, from beneath the stone, it rose like smoke, like breath returning to lungs. And, the sound, a heartbeat, but not Ellen's, not humanity's. The first heartbeat, the one that was silenced when heaven chose obedience over understanding. It returned, and with it, the eye began to open, but not as it once was. Now, it looked outward, at creation, of Ellen, and then it spoke no words, just permission. The 9th page dissolved into flame. The chapel burst like a seed, and Father Ellen fell, not downward, but back into the world, back into the stone confessional, where it all began. A candle flickered beside him. A boy knocked on the screen and whispered, "Forgive me, Father, for I remember what you forgot." Episode 13, The Baptism That Should Have Never Happened. The confessional was warm, too warm. Father Ellen blinked. The boy Saturday across the screen, unmoving, but something was different this time. The candle did not flicker. It breathed. Outside, the bells rang 13 times again, but the world beyond the chapel doors was not the same one he remembered. Light seeped under the cracks, but not sunlight. It was red, like the last breath of a star. "I know who you are," the boy whispered. Ellen's throat tightened. "Do you?" The boy nodded. "You're the priest who baptized me before I was born." Ellen's blood turned cold. He remembered a ceremony deep beneath the seminary, a child born of a vision, swaddled not in cloth, but in scripture. He had been told to say the words, to anoint the child with ink, not water. The page had dissolved into the infant's skin, and then he forgot. "Until now, I screamed inside you," the boy said. "Every time you slept, every time you preached, I was the page they buried in your chest, Father, but I am not a page anymore. Ellen leaned closer. What are you? The boy smiled, not cruelly, but with unbearable sorrow. I am the gospel you were too afraid to write. Outside, footsteps, hundreds of them. The townspeople had returned but not as they were. Each one bore marks on their foreheads, shaped like letters in a language never spoken aloud. Each held a candle that sang. Saint Gunnar stood among them, eyes open, silent. Ellen opened the confessional door. The boy stepped out beside him, barefoot, glowing faintly from beneath the skin as if scripture still lived in his veins. Where do we go now? Ellen asked. The boy turned to him. We don't go anywhere. We remain to speak what others buried, to remember what heaven tried to forget. And with that, the chapel doors blew open. But it was not wind. It was revelation. It moved through them all. The candles roared. The pews cracked. The altar split. And from beneath it, a book, bound in flesh, sealed in silence, waiting to be written. Episode 14, the book that wrote back. It was not a book. It was a mouth, bound shut, wrapped in stitched scripture and sealed with ash from forgotten altars. It pulsed beneath the broken altar like a sleeping god that had starved long enough to become legend. Ellen stepped toward it. The boy placed a hand on his chest. If you touch it, it remembers. Remembers what? Everything heaven erased. The congregation circled the altar, not chanting, breathing as one, a living choir of memory, inhaling the past, exhaling the truth. Saint Gunnar stood behind Ellen now. Her voice returned not as a whisper, but as a chorus of every woman who had been silenced by scripture. This is the sin, she said, not what we did, but what we allowed them to forget. The altar cracked again. The book opened its mouth and spoke, not in words, in names. Names of those rewritten out of creation. Names of saints that were uncanonized for remembering too much. Names of children born knowing the sound of the original scream. Ellen fell to his knees. The flash page inside him writhed. His back arched, his mouth opened involuntarily, and from within him poured ink. Lines of scripture flooded from his throat, covering the floor, snaking up the walls, carving themselves into the bones of the chapel. The building shuddered it in collapse, in resurrection. And then the boy stepped into the altar. He did not vanish. He merged with the book, with the scream, with the forgotten. That chapel fell silent. Ellen stood. He was no longer wearing robes. His skin was parchment, and across his chest, a single line of moving ink. Let this gospel remain unwritten, so no one forgets again. The congregation bowed. The bells did not ring. They breathed. Episode 15, the heaven that screamed back. The chapel no longer belonged to earth. It hovered in the sky, not in space but in the space between silence and scream. Its walls, once stone, were now scripture. Its floor was memory, and its ceiling was a veil thin enough to hear what God had never said. Ellen stood at the center, skin still inscribed, heart no longer beating but echoing. Around him, the congregation knelt no longer human, not divine, but aware. Saint Gunnar stepped forward, her voice calm. You've done what heaven never dared. Ellen turned toward the altar, now a living one in the world. And now, she looked up. The veil trembled. It began to split. From above came a light but not the sterile glow of sanctity. This was fractured, broken, beautiful in its ruin. It poured down like spilled ink from a torn sky. And with it, a voice, not one, all. Every prayer ever prayed in fear. Every cry ever silenced at birth. Every hymn that twisted truth into obedience. The chapel screamed, and so did heaven, but not in rage. In release, the scream poured through the congregation, through Gunnar, through Elim rattling their bones, undoing the curse of silence. The veil tore completely. Behind it, there was no throne. There was only a mirror, and in it, Ellen saw not himself. He saw every soul who had ever been rewritten. He stepped forward. The mirror shimmered. The boy, one who was never born, and yet always present, appeared beside him. No longer a child, no longer separate. Together, they touched the mirror, and the reflection smiled. The scream stopped, not because it ended, because it was heard. And in that, silence, pure, reverent, terrifying, something new began. A book, not written, spoken, not to be read, to be remembered. And so the final page turned, unwritten, unforgotten, unforgiven, and eternal. Season 2, title, What Happened to Those Who Heard It? Episode 1, The Woman Who Heard It Through Her Stillborn. It began in a delivery room. Florencia Alvarez was 32 when the child stopped moving. She had felt him the night before kicking, restless, her belly rising with breath and promise. But when the scream came from the chapel on the hill when the bells rang, 13 times and the sky opened like a wound, something inside her stopped. The doctors told her he was gone, stillborn, but as they laid the lifeless body on her chest, something happened. That child opened his eyes, only once, and whispered. No one else heard it, not the doctor, not the nurse who fainted, but Florencia did. She heard the voice of her son say a sentence that burned itself into the air like fire without flame. Heaven is not where they said it was. Then, silence. His eyes closed again, his breath gone, but the room did not return to stillness, because the walls began to weep ink. Black lines snaked from the ceiling. Symbols appeared in the lights overhead, and on the monitor beside her, the baby's flatline pulsed once in it with a heartbeat, with a note, the same musical tone that shattered windows in the chapel last month. Florencia was never discharged. The hospital burned 3 days later. Firefighters said it smelled not of smoke but old paper. And Florencia, she walked out untouched, carrying her child wrapped in a shroud of scriptures that no priest could identify. The Vatican arrived by nightfall. They did not ask questions. They sealed the room. But before they left, one of them, a blind man with hands covered in rosary scars, stood before the crib and whispered, "The scream has found its first mother." Florencia didn't weep. She simply looked up at the red sky and whispered back, "Then let heaven listen this time." Episode 2, The Choir That Came Without Mouths. They arrived in silence. A group of 34 children, dressed in identical gray robes, barefoot, eyes closed. They walked through the gates of St. Argento Cathedral one by one, holding hands, humming nothing. No one knew where they came from. No town reported them missing. No parents came looking. They simply appeared on the steps of the church in Lisbon at sunrise. And when the doors were opened by Father Leo, they bowed not to him, but to the crucifix above. And then they sang. No lips moved, but the sound, if it could be called, that shook the air inside the cathedral. It wasn't a hymn. It was a frequency, a memory. Every candle in the church extinguished itself, and Father Leo fell to his knees, weeping blood, because he recognized the song. It was the same frequency recorded by Vatican instruments in the final scream from Ellen's chapel. The children did not speak. Instead, they began writing on the walls, on the stained glass, on the pews, but they had no pens. They wrote with their fingers, and every word appeared backwards, not mirrored, unwritten. A bishop was flown in. He arrived with 6 guards and a sealed relic. The moment he stepped inside the cathedral, his relic burst into ash. The oldest child turned to him, opened his eyes, and finally spoke. Just 3 words. He's still writing. That night, the children lay in a perfect circle beneath the altar, their mouths stitched shut by a thread of gold no one had seen before. But their chests moved to the rhythm of something breathing far beneath the marble. And when the bishop leaned close to one, he heard a voice from inside the child's ribs. Not their voice, Elaine's. He was not dead. He was not gone. He was riding through them, and somewhere, far from Lisbon, the ink began to spread again. Episode 3, The Eyes That Wept Ink. She hadn't cried in 17 years. Not since the night Sister Magdalena had found her calendar, what the convent called. It when her hands bled with that wound and her breath echoed with names she'd never heard. But on the morning of the 3rd scream, she wept, and it wasn't salt that ran from her eyes. It was ink, black, thick, burning. She awoke gasping in her cell at Santa Pedra Monastery, surrounded by scrolls older than the nation that held them. Her rosary shattered in her grip. Her crucifix melted at the touch of her skin. On the wall across from her bed, an outline had appeared overnight shaped like a door, but with no handle, no hinges, just a sentence carved in Latin. The scream ceased through silence. She followed the trail her tears left on the stone floor. It led to the chapel's archive, vault sealed since 1892. Inside were books that no one dared catalog, writings burned by decree, pages chained to stone altars, but they were open now, and someone had added a new volume. It was bound in wax, no title, just the mark of an eye stabbed through with a quill. As she reached toward it, she heard the first voice in it aloud, but from behind her teeth. "Tell them what I showed you. Tell them what I screamed." She fell to her knees. The ink from her eyes pooled around her, and in it, a reflection that was not hers. Alan, mouth closed, but eyes wide, and behind him, a door. The same shape burned into her wall. She fled, but wherever she went, ink followed, in the holy water, in the sky, in the eyes of children staring alone at the crucifix. By nightfall, every statue in the monastery began to cry black, and every nun dreamed the same sentence. The veil didn't tear, it opened its eye. Episode 4: The cross that refused to stay upright. The first time it fell, they blamed the wind, but by the 5th time, even the bishop could no longer pretend. The cross atop St. Noriel's cathedral had stood for centuries, carved from petrified wood and blessed by 3 popes. It had endured war, earthquakes, even fire, but now, every morning before dawn, it lay flat on the steps, as if it no longer wanted to stand. Father Ramius ordered it re-raised each day, and each night, it fell again without a sound. No crack, no break, just refusal. Then, on the 6th morning, they found something new. Not the cross, a hole, in the exact place where its base had stood, carved perfectly into the stone, deep, wide enough for a man to climb down, and inside, darkness that light refused to touch. They lowered a camera, it didn't return. They lowered a man, he never screamed, but he came back speaking in a voice that wasn't his. He called himself the Correction, and he claimed to remember the day the first cross was carved from wood that never grew, on land that never belonged to earth. Father Ramius locked him in the crypt. But that night, every crucifix in the city turned upside down. Not by hand, by gravity. The next morning, the original cross reappeared, but this time, it stood by, itself erect, rigid, and weeping. From the center, where the wood met the vertical beam, a thick ink dripped, and etched into its grain. He did not die. He was rewritten. Father Ramius knelt beneath it. He no longer prayed. He simply whispered, "Then rewrite me." The wind did not blow, but the cross fell again, toward him. Episode 5: The nun who tried to forget the scream. Sister Aurelia had not spoken in 20 years. It was her vow silence until the second coming, a private promise made in a chapel whose name no longer appears on maps. Her voice, once melodic, had been a gift to the Vatican choir until the scream came. Until Ellen. Now, she wandered the mountains of northern Spain, alone, but silence, it seemed, no longer protected her. It began with the birds. Each morning, their songs grew stranger, less chirping, more echo, as though they were repeating something only they could hear. One day, a sparrow landed on her windowsill and opened its beak. What came out was not song, it was a whisper. "Do you still remember how to scream?" She dropped her rosary. That night, she tried to pray, but the words fell apart in her mind. Every verse twisted, some became confession. The Lord's Prayer rewrote itself in her journal. She ran, through fog, through forests, until she reached a clearing she didn't remember. At the center stood a statue of the Virgin Mary, but Mary was weeping up, her tears rising into the sky like smoke, and in her hands, a baby, not Jesus. Ellen, older, eyes wide, mouth stitched shut with golden thread. Sister Aurelia fell to her knees, and for the first time in decades, she spoke. "I remember." The wind didn't move, but the trees bent as if listening. Then the statue cracked, not crumbled, cracked open. Inside it, a page, with breathing. She touched it and screamed, not in pain, in memory, because the page knew her voice, and it had been waiting. Episode 6: The door that appeared in every church. They began showing up the same day, across 5 continents, in churches of every denomination, size, and a door appeared, always the same, narrow, with that shimmer like ink, no knob, no hinges, a single word carved into the center, return. No one could open it, but everyone who looked at it felt something shift behind their ribs, a pulling, like a forgotten song trapped inside their bones. In front, a child touched the door and vanished. in Buenos Aires. An old priest burst into tears before it and confessed a sin in a language no one recognized, then dropped dead. And in the hills outside Assisi, the door opened itself. Only once, a monk named Silvano saw what lay beyond it. He has not spoken since. He writes now, endlessly, with both hands, pages of parchment spilling from his cell, covering the floor, the walls, even his body. But no one can read what he writes, until a blind girl wandered into the monastery and picked up a page. She smiled and spoke a name, Ellen. The monks fell to their knees, not because she spoke it, but because every statue in the monastery turned its head to listen. Now the doors won't stop appearing. In hospitals, in prisons, in dreams, every door is sealed, but they all whisper the same thing. He is writing us home. Episode 7, The Ink That Moved on Its Own. Somewhere in the Vatican's deep vaults past the forbidden books, the unspoken relics, and the hallway where saints have been heard screaming in their sleep, there is a room that had been sealed since 1513. Until now, the seal broke itself at dawn, and the manuscript inside began to breathe. Archivist Tommaso, blind in one eye and sworn to silence, was the first to witness it. The room was cold when he entered, but the manuscript radiated heat, not warmth ever. It pulsed on the table. Its cover bled. He stepped closer. The pages began flipping on their own, slowly at first, then faster, until they blurred like grains. Then they stopped, and a single line formed on the open page. He is not writing prophecy. He is correcting history. Tommaso collapsed, not unconscious. Remembering, he remembered a prayer he had never said. He remembered a sermon he had never heard. And worst of all, remembered his name being removed from the book of life, not for sin, but for silence. When the other archivists arrived, Tommaso was gone. Only the manuscript remained. But now, it was writing again, in real time, in ink that crawled like insects across the parchment, drawing not letters, but faces. And one of them, clear as morning, was Florencia, the woman who had heard the scream through her stillborn. Beneath her face, a line, she will be the first to rewrite Eden. And on the next page, the paper began to bleed. Episode 8, The Eden Fragment. They found it buried beneath the floorboards of a church that no longer had walls. A single shard of stone, smooth as glass, warm to the touch, and on its surface, 7 words. She has already stepped into the garden. Florencia. Somewhere a no longer on maps wandered ruins that breathed. Ruins that used to be a monastery. Each step she took, vines grew from the stone. Not earthly vines. These bled ink. These whispered, and the whispers all said the same name, Ellen. Florencia carried her child still stillborn, yet still unrotted, wrapped in linen embroidered with verses she'd never written. His eyes never opened again, but his mouth moved in dreams. She did not pray. She listened. One night, the garden opened. Not metaphor. A door of thorns split the hillside, parting not like a gate, but like a wound remembering its cut. And inside, a field of white trees. Every branch bore a different version of the Bible. In every language, every era, every twist. Some books bled, some glowed, one floated, weeping ash. At the center of the grove, a well. She approached, carved into its rim, Genesis New 1. She looked down and saw her reflection, but behind her stood someone else, Ellen, older, and smiling at with peace, but with understanding. It placed a hand on her shoulder and said, softly, before the world was written, it was remembered. And you, Florencia, are memory inbound. The scream returned, but this time, it sang. Episode 9, The Gospel According to No One. The garden didn't end. Florencia walked for hours through roots that hummed like choirs and leaves that whispered rewritten prayers. The air was thick with remembrance not of sin, but of what came before words. And then she found it. A book, resting on a stone table carved into the shape of an open hand. Its cover was white as bone, stitched with golden thread. No title, no author. She opened it. There were no chapters, only questions, written in ink that moved. Each time she blinked, the words reshaped themselves, not to deceive her but to ask differently. Who gave God his name? What is older than Genesis? If a scream is remembered long enough, does it become a voice? She turned the page. The child in her arms stirred. For the first time since birth, his fingers moved. She dropped to her knees. From the trees around her, a low vibration began. Pages tore themselves free and flew like moths toward the sky, forming a spiral above the well. Ellen stepped forward again, but now it bled from the mouth. "You are reading the gospel that no prophet ever dared speak," he said, "because it is not his word, it is ours." Florencia looked into the well once more. No reflection, only pages falling endlessly, and at the bottom, something began to write, not with ink, with light, words not seen but understood, and her name was among them, not as a witness, as a co-author. Episode 10. The child who began to breathe. It took a breath. The boy, the one who had never cried, never opened his eyes, never moved until now, in Florencia's arms, the impossible happened. A gasp, not loud, not human, a sound like paper catching fire from the inside. His eyes didn't open, but hers did, because the scream had changed him. No, not change chosen. Florencia held him tighter, stepping away from the stone hand and the book without title. She felt his chest rise again, not once, twice, rhythm now, breath, existence. Ellen stood silent. The light from the well pulsed, no longer showing wordsonly a shape, a heart, but not anatomical, a heart made of lines, intersections, tabs between pages, a map. "Where is it leading?" Florencia asked. Ellen did not answer. The boy did, without words. He raised his Antony, trembling and pointed. Behind them, the trees had parted, not from wind, from memory, and down the path figures, walking, mothers, priests, children, the choir from Lisbon, the nun who screamed again, the archivist who vanished into the Vatican. They were all coming, each holding something broken that now pulsed with meaning. Books, crosses, mirrors, bones. The scream had summoned them, not as followers, but as rewriters. Florencia looked down at her son, whose breath now sensed with the garden itself. "I don't know how to lead them," she whispered. Ellen stepped forward. "You don't have to lead them." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You just have to remember what we were before we forgot." The light from the well rose higher, faster, and somewhere across the sky, a tear began to open. Episode 11. The sky that refused to close. The tear widened, not like cloth, but like a wound that had never healed. A gash across the sky where stars bled backward, and time blinked like a dying eye. Florencia shielded her son, but he did not flinch. Instead, he opened his mouth. No sound, only breath. And yet the world shuddered. The trees bowed, the well dimmed, and the crowd behind them, every choir child, every silenced nun, every bleeding archivist fell silent. Then the first word rose, not spoken, revealed, etched into the tear itself like lightning spelling scripture. Reverse. The figures wept, because they understood. This was not a prophecy. It was a correction. From the other side of the sky, something stepped forward, not through space but through memory. It wore no face, no voice, only shape, a human outline made of pages, each page blank. But as it walked, the pages fell laden by one with the faces of those who had ever dared to scream back at heaven. Ellen stepped forward, trembling. "I remember you," he whispered. "You were the first book never written." The page being turned to Florencia's son, and bowed. Because the child was not a messenger, he was the margin, the space left open for a truth too loud to be canonized. The sky screamed it in rage, but in release, and from the tear poured not angels, but authors, tattered, ancient, erased. Each one carried a name that had been burned from holy history. They gathered around the child. Florencia clutched him close. "What do we do now?" Her son finally opened his eyes. They were not his. They were ours. Reflected, remembered, ready. Episode 12. The language before light. The authors knelt, not to worship but to listen. Florencia held her son as the sky crackled open above them, the rip forming a mouth where stars once rested. The wind had no direction to which circled, folded, repeated, like breath learning itself for the first time. The child stood, not fully, not humanly. He rose like a page being lifted by a thought. And then he spoke, but no one heard words, only memory. Every soul in the crowd collapsed to their knees in fear. But in recognition, they saw themselves before sound. before sin, before separation. The child's voice was not sounded with structure, and every sentence he breathed rewrote the bones of the world. The trees unbent, the earth cracked open and revealed roots shaped like letters. Ancient languages long buried in the soil now surfaced in the veins of leaves. Ellen fell forward, hand pressed to the ground. "He's not writing scripture," he whispered. "He's restoring the tongue God lost when he wept for the first time." The page being stepped into the circle. It held no pen. It was the pen, and with every step, the sky rewrote itself. Florencia turned to Ellen, tears streaming. "This isn't a new Bible," Ellen nodded. "It's what the first Bible tried to silence." The light from above split again, but this time downward, like roots crashing into the sky itself. One final word etched itself into the heavens. Before, and everyone there remembered what had been taken. A language made only of truth, a sound only the soul could understand. The scream had never been made. It was a reclamation, and now it was almost finished. Episode 13, The Final Silence. The wind stopped, not slope ceased. Like creation was holding its breath, Florencia stood beneath the sky's wound, her son in her arms. He no longer moved, not from stillness but from completion, as if breath itself had finished its sentence. The crowd of awakened ones remained kneeling. None spoke, none wept. Their eyes reflected not light but memory. Ellen stepped forward. He no longer bled, no longer carried pages beneath his skin. He was, for the first time, empty, and he smiled. This is what it sounds like when heaven listens. Above them, the tear in the sky began to pulse. The shape of it no longer resembled damage, it resembled an ear, a listening wound. The page being knelt before the child, and then it did the unthinkable. It tore a page from itself. Florencia gasped. The page bled gold. The being placed it into the child's chest, and the child exhaled one final breath. The light fractured, but no scream came. Only silence, perfect, holy, whole. The wound in the sky did not close. It folded into a single line and wrote one sentence into the air. Let no voice be silenced again. The world shifted, not forward, inward, and for the first time since Eden fell, humanity remembered its voice, not to preach, not to beg, but to speak as one. Florencia wept, not for loss, but because silence had finally finished its story, and in its place, the final gospel had begun. Episode 14, The Day the Scriptures Came Alive. It didn't start with fire. It started with motion. Bibles across the world and in nightstands, locked in vaults, buried with martyrs began to tremble. Not pages fluttering in wind. No, they turned themselves. Each one flipped to a different verse. Each verse began to change. Ink reformed, letters bent backward, crossed into each other, dissolved into new meaning. Verses that had condemned now embraced. Lines that once punished now asked forgiveness. And some pages, some bled. In Jerusalem, a priest opened a centuries-old tome and found his name written in it, not printed, etched. In Lagos, a Troy boy fainted when the Gospel of John whispered his mother's birth date. And in Rome, a crucifix blinked, not from miracle, from recognition. The Gospel wasn't being reworded, it was being remembered. Florencia stood atop the hill where the sky had torn. The child in her arms now glowed with light, but with language. People no longer bowed. They stood and read, not aloud. Within, they saw themselves between the lines. Their fears, their losses, their refusals. And still, they were not condemned. Ellen approached a cathedral wall. On it, an engraving once carved in Latin now peeled, like old painting revealed a new phrase beneath. He who speaks alone is a tyrant. He who listens with others becomes scripture. Every tongue echoed the same verse. Different words, same truth. The world wasn't ending, it was publishing. The final gospel was not a book, it was a people. Episode 15, The Gospel That Had No Ending. They gathered without invitation, across deserts, ruins, megacities, prisons, temples. People came, not to convert, not to preach, but to contribute. The final gospel had no cover, no canon, no keeper. It spread through breath, through thought, through the silence between two people who finally dared to listen instead of speak. Florencia Saturday beneath the torn sky with her son in her lap. He no longer glowed, he simply was. human and not, word and silence. She kissed his forehead and felt nothing divine, only something true. Ellen no longer walked beside her. He had become language now. Every time someone remembered his scream, a flower bloomed from a forgotten grave, the page being unraveled slowly, letting its leaves fall across the earth. Each one landed in a different country, in a different hand. At a different moment, someone was about to give up. And on each page, only one line: "You were never unwritten." In Istanbul, a woman who had been mute since childhood sang a note that cracked the crescent moon above a minaret. In New York, a boy typed a sentence into a search bar and the screen whispered back his ancestor's voice. In Ethiopia, a blind elder pointed at the sky and said, "That's where Eden rewrote us." No one bowed anymore. They collaborated. The child grew, not through years but through witness. He walked beside mothers who had lost children. He Saturday with priests who had lost faith. He read with prisoners who had forgotten their own names. Everywhere he went, the gospel expanded in it like doctrine, like breath. And then, one morning, Florence awoke and he was gone. No footprints, no goodbye, only a sentence carved into the stone where she had laid. "You are the final verse." Florencia smiled and said nothing, because now everyone was writing.